Welcome to the Digible Dudes podcast. Rita, I won't say fantasies, but like forward thinking.
I loved already that very quick distinction.
Yeah. We've been dark like 2 months because I went on parental leave. So this is the first one back. And I was like, oh yeah, the first one back, it's going to be so energetic. I can't wait. And then I don't feel super energetic today. Maybe it's because I told you about the 5:30 wake up and then snow shoveling by hand, and now I'm just drained. So
yeah, I would guess that has something to do with it.
So I bollocksed this welcome back.
Another statism. Shenanigans, for those that don't know, is another one to look out for.
Yeah.
I used that yesterday, so some of your isms are back.
Yeah. And my it's not pregnancy brain. What is it for the non-birthing parent? What do they call that?
Dumb dad brain.
Dumb dad brain. Yeah, that is in full effect for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wish I could tell you it goes away.
Yeah. Does it get worse? Does it just kind of keep on going?
I'd have to let them answer that.
Okay.
I think I'll just say flurries.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I'm here. I'm back. And now we're scheduled. Erica has it scheduled out for like 2 months or something on interviews and things. So we will catch back up and get into our normal weekly rhythm. So there won't be a big dark. And this is the other thing I realized. We totally should have put had pre-recorded like an episode that was like, hey, we're going to be on hiatus for like 10 weeks or whatever.
Yeah.
And it struck me like in week 9 of the hiatus. I was like, oh shoot, we should have
missed that boat.
Yeah.
That was before the baby came.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's where I guess Olivia and Erica will keep us more on track moving forward.
Yep. Excited. I'm sure we'll have Olivia on for at least a short cast. But since you mentioned her name, yeah, we have a marketing director joining us for the first time. And we're super pumped to see what she can bring to the table, but certainly some level of additional organization with this podcast is part of that. But she'll also be happy to know she's got Erica to help reel us in.
Yeah. Well, Erica did organize this one, and on this episode we have Phil, previously from Amenify, but now he's doing some consulting work, and he came on to talk about the changing consumer and their relationship with your brand for multifamily. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to assume that you deliberately did not include his last name in that.
100%. Are
okay.
You kidding me?
Yeah, I thought I knew you that well. Well, with Phil's help, he got it right, in past this intro, but I am going to put you on the spot. Give it a swing.
I don't even frankly remember it. If I was reading it, I would give it a crack. Sorry, Phil. We went to lunch. It was lovely. He'll be back. Yeah. But I just know him as Phil.
Well, when David first meets somebody, and certainly there's examples of this on the cast, their last name could be Smith, and he'll make sure he's got it right. So, yeah. I got a kick out of that moment with Phil, because it's not your everyday last name.
If we would have recorded the intro right after, I would have taken a swing, because I would have then still in my head. But now I couldn't even tell you the first letter of the name right now.
I'm going to go with M.
Okay.
As in mom.
I thought it was S. This is how far off my brain was.
Yeah. Well, anyways, yes, you did get that right. As far as, kind of what the focus or, what the line of conversation was with Phil.
And biggest takeaways, why should they continue listening?
Well, and maybe it's because, birds of a common feather flock together, but just, I'm so glad I got that right, by the way.
Screen doors on a submarine.
But it was just his background coming predominantly from non-multifamily, I think always brings a different perspective, I guess, for us, for the cast. Far from a lifer, but also converted, similar to you and I, to somebody that seems like he wants to stay in this industry for good. So I thought that was fun, him coming at it from a little bit different. But yeah, he really hit hard, is brand loyalty dead or not, and how does that apply in our universe? And I thought he did a nice job of kind of covering the spectrum, from, property branding to, the tech companies that are now kind of usurping, I guess, these properties and how operators are thinking about it. And then, he definitely shared, even though at the stage, I guess he's consulting now with Amenify, but really offered some, I think, interesting perspective and color around Amenify and where they're at and how they got there and stuff. So a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, when he was talking, all I remember, or one of the things I remember thinking was, is it not just brand loyalty dead, but is just loyalty dead or waning, right? Because we were talking about it with like all the, like how employees don't stick at companies as often. In fact, people jump careers more frequently now, and not just even like out of companies. So can you think of anything where loyalty is as strong as you ever knew it, or in all sectors are you seeing loyalty or feeling or hearing the conversation about loyalty waning?
You know, I think I couldn't tell you exactly when this happened, but one of the things that a trend in marketing that hit within the last decade, but I don't, funny enough, hear as much about today is cause marketing. And I think at the root of cause marketing is brand loyalty, is, you know, if you get that right, and Simon Sinek, you know, one of many people we will reference from time to time on this cast, talks about how valuable and powerful the why is. And he points, you know, many times to Apple and how that's created, he never used the word cult, but just like, I think to some degree, a great loyalty, because of the way they position themselves and obviously, you know, the product itself. So I don't think it's dead across the board. I think, you know, if you can connect more on the purpose and kind of the mission of the brands, which so many books and marketing classes are now focused on, that you can still find that. But I think that there is a point of diminishing returns, and that's not the same for everybody, where you and I have talked about this even with our own employee loyalty. You know, there's a point where we end, you know, where we've done everything we can to generate that, you know, or build that relationship. And it's not going to stick or connect with everybody, but it's super powerful when there's even a few. And I think on some level, that's how, you know, bigger brands and companies have to view it too, is, you know, it does still exist. You can get to it, and you just have to somewhat manage your expectations. Otherwise you might be set up for disappointment, and even more in this era than 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Well, I do agree with you. It's not dead. I'm just wondering if it's more challenging than it used to be, or because I also feel like if you screw up, people seem way more likely to discount you immediately now. Yeah. And so, and I'll go back to like my, this is somewhat tie, but I remember growing up.
Cancel culture. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there's that. But growing up, we always had Aquafresh, and I always saw the commercials for Crest. And I was like, oh, why don't we ever get Crest, Mom? And she's like, because your dad grew up with Crest, and he hated being forced to use Crest, so he won't have any more. I'm like, so he lived with his parents 20 years. So 20 years of Crest, and now we've been on Aquafresh for 40 years. I don't know like how this works, meaning the loyalty, but where I'm going is people, they used to say like if you were a CPG brand, it's like you get them at 18 and then you have them for 40 years and like the payoff, the CAC, you know, is awesome. I'm just wondering if that's the same. Like, is that the same now? And I'm guessing not, because I do think people are way more in tune with your brand. And so when you screw up, you're way more likely to lose them. And it's almost like, should you actually be silent in many ways? Because it's one of those things, it's almost like it's the 7 powers. You can have all this brand equity, but it can like reverse on you. Like if you're that present in whatever the mind of the public, and then you're that visible, and then you screw up, it's like now you're going to lose people really quickly too.
Super interesting, I guess, take on it. And simply put, you know, be careful not to try too hard, because if you are overwhelming somebody, then yeah, the possibility of backfiring is definitely real. I think this is such an interesting, and we said that, you know, with Phil, like conversation, you can take it so many different places, because another thing that occurs to me is, and I don't know this will ever change with humanity, is we're creatures of habit. Mm-hmm. And don't confuse, you know, I guess habitual usage of a brand with brand loyalty, because I'll use just a very topical example of like my Acura. I'm not loyal to the brand Acura. And it's not that I think it's a bad brand. I think a lot of people have probably a positive association with it, but I have gotten, you know, a comfort level with it. And so when I go out and purchase the next vehicle, there is an advantage that Acura already has, and that I have some level of a relationship, I guess, with them. So I might go out and buy another MDX.
Yeah.
That's not brand loyalty, but that happens, I think, all the time, where people are overwhelmed by choices. And in an era where choices are just, proliferating at a ridiculous rate in every imaginable part of our lives, does it actually force people to narrow their I guess habits and routines, and then give brands and companies false ideas of how loyal in fact their customer base is? The other part that we didn't dive into more, that I would be really interested to hear, and whether that's from you or Phil comes back with it, is what is the most modern method right now of scoring brand loyalty? I would love to get into whoever built that and just deconstruct it and talk about it, because when he got into it, I was like, we started talking about usage statistics versus, the bottom line, the economics of it, general sentiment, things like net promoter score, retention, communication within the community, blah, blah, blah. And so I told on the, I think I said this, but I use the word fractional a lot on that when we talk to him. And I'm probably stealing from you because you use that word too, but that makes it so damn hard to know exactly, what's real, what's not, and then where to optimize, I guess, to really get more loyalty out of somebody. So it's a fascinating topic.
I love your take. Just to highlight it, just what we just talked about, but it's like, just because I'm in Slack every day doesn't mean I like it.
Exactly.
Right? It's like, and they may think I'm loyal because my usage statistics are great. It's like, they're not actually that great, but
I think I won't provoke you with Slack. Yeah.
All right. Well, anyways, if you guys want to hear more about brand loyalty and get in the weeds, then stay tuned. Okay, we're here with Phil. Phil, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, great to be here. Phil Matsuhashi. I was a co-founder, COO, CRO at Amenify. We built a platform for lifestyle services that plugged into multifamily industry, mostly Class A, 175,000 homes, 30 cities. I am currently on the advisory board at Amenify, stepped away about a quarter ago. Honestly, just foot was twitching at all the exciting stuff going on in prop tech. I had, put in quite a tour of duty and wanted to work on some new things. And right now I'm sort of bouncing around, doing some consulting, doing some podcasts, power networking, and keeping my eye out for what's next.
Yeah, cool.
Can I jump right in real fast? You mentioned how you got connected to Amenify and with Everett. If you don't mind sharing that with our listeners, because they've heard Everett a few times on the podcast. We also had him at the summit. So that'd be a good connection to make, because you had also told us you started more on the ad networking and the programmatic side and whatnot before you got into multifamily. But Dave and I always find it interesting, like, to hear about how somebody got sucked into multifamily. And that sounds negative, because, we are very happy to be here, and we identified it as a place that we
You
wanted
didn't want
to
to
be.
say like sucked into the muck.
Yeah, right. You like to call it the orbit. And then it sounds like you plan to stay. So that's the other thing I'd love for you to touch on before we fully dive in. So, how did you make the connection with Everett and Amenify? And then it sounds like you want to stay in multifamily through PropTech.
I would love to. So it's good encapsulation. Basically, the first part of my career was media, ad tech, digital advertising, the development of sort of the pipes, if you will, under the internet to do all of the, digital advertising and programmatic advertising, where all the smartest minds are now. If it weren't for all the engineers working on programmatic advertising on the internet, we'd probably be on Mars by now. I took a step away from that whole industry and was doing some consulting, and I was doing some consulting in that industry and got introduced to Everett through a mutual friend, a childhood friend of mine, and a colleague of his from when he was doing asset management. And and he was looking to start sort of get Amenify going, and needed to put sort of partnerships together in the early iterations of Amenify. And the thing that got me most excited is, spending 15 plus years in ad tech. The thing that most people will tell you about it is it's very intangible, right? You go to work and you do a bunch of work, and all this stuff is happening in the ether, and you don't see, you don't really feel like you see any of the fruits of your labor, right? And one of the things I got real excited about was, of course, you see these big, beautiful assets as you drive down the street, but if you're not in that industry, you don't always think about them the same way. And started to tell me about Amenify and what he was trying to build, and then all of a sudden, like when you hear something and you see it everywhere, it was a big flip for me in terms of, wow, this is such a tangible world where you're literally working on helping people live better. You're providing people with homes, and you're thinking about how to amenitize those properties and make their lifestyle and their experience better. And that got me really excited, just how tangible it was. And as we know, right, sometimes it's hard for tech to inject itself at the speed that it does in other industries into multifamily, right? So I look at that as like there's still such a huge opportunity for so much innovation that's happening, right? But how do you get that innovation across these large portfolios that want that innovation? And so that's, I would love to stay in multifamily. That's a lot of the conversations I'm having, but it's really the tangible nature of the industry that's really exciting for me coming from ad tech.
Cool.
Well, I'd tack on, meaning, not to lead you too much, but there's more than just the tangible, I would imagine. Like when you deal with ad tech, there's some folks that aren't super pleasant necessarily to work with. As you mentioned, like there's a lot of great brain power in ad tech, but it's not a bunch of kumbaya necessarily, or like very cordial folks. You told us before we started that you used to be in New York trying to convince publishers that, the print publishers about digital, and that it's really cutthroat, or can be really cutthroat, particularly in New York. And so I'm sure it felt really comfortable once you started to know a lot of the folks in multifamily and how just great the community is.
I definitely agree with that. I'd say, in ad tech, a long tenure is 18 months, right? Mm-hmm. And it fascinated me, as I started to really get into growing Amenify. It's like meeting people at different operators, like, oh yeah, I've been here 20 years, right? And so that was really refreshing for me to see that it's a community that people care about, and people stick around in, and they develop their own brands, right, in these communities as heads of these large REITs and managers and whatnot. And so people definitely stick around in the industry, which is also fascinating considering there's like maybe two, I think 1 or 2 schools where you can actually get a degree in property management. So that part's really interesting too, that how people find the industry is interesting, and then how they tend to stay in it.
Tons of hospitality, but not multi-family. Although I did hear, somebody told me recently that there's now 7 across the country, which regardless, 7 is not a lot. That's still very few, and I still haven't met someone that's gone through one of those programs. All right, well, let's then move into the topic at hand, which is brand loyalty. So when you were at Amenify, you said a lot of the challenges you had to work on was not only do you have to get the operator interested, the property management company, but then once, just because they signed a contract doesn't mean like it's all roses on your side. You've got to get the consumers to adopt, right, the technology and start making it part of their own, workflow, if you will, for their life. So talk us through some of those challenges. And as you mentioned beforehand to us that you'd been working on it for 7 years. So 7 years is a long time. So what's changed in 7 years, and sort of give us the past, present, future of consumers with multifamily?
Yeah. So I think that was a very eye-opening, sort of almost sobering moment at Amenify when we realized, oh, great, like these properties have now trusted us to sell their residents these services, housekeeping, dog walking, so on and so forth. We were a B2B brand, and now we have to sell a direct to consumer product. And, this was well into the the iPhone age, right? And so you've got, some of the most sophisticated apps that you're competing with, and you're trying to find a place on someone's phone, right? You're competing with Uber and Netflix and Airbnb, and how do we fit in? How do we possibly fit in on a shoestring budget? And so, one is how do we build a great product, but also, how do we communicate the product to the consumer out there? And it got me into thinking and sort of thinking through and sort of solutioning with the Amenify team on who is the consumer today and how do they compare to what they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or, prior to, I guess, Web 2 or prior to the iPhone and whatnot, and, how the consumers evolved. And I think, we think about how you define the consumer today and how the consumer thinks about products versus how they used to think about it in the past. And I think the thing you then attach that to or connect that to is brand loyalty, right? So, because you can talk about consumers, but really what matters when you talk about consumers is what consumers associate with, what products they buy, what turns them on to a brand and what doesn't. And that's shifted over the past, 20 years or so. And for better or worse, the consumer is far more sophisticated today than they were 20 years ago. And there's an argument that, brand loyalty is dead, right? Like, no one cares anymore about brand. And really, I would push back on that and say that brand loyalty is not dead. It's just evolved given the change and given like some fundamental changes in the landscape, regarding kind of democratization of information, access to information, the ability for consumers to have a voice where they couldn't previously. And that's changed how the consumer thinks about their leverage with brands that they would associate with, right? There's also the ability for consumers to kind of think of themselves as a brand, right? And, everybody has a voice through all of these social platforms, and a lot of them think thoroughly through how they want to present that voice, present that brand, and they think of themselves as a brand, and then think about how they want to associate and who they want to associate with. And so, that's something that I think about a lot, just, intellectually, not necessarily only with regard to when I was working on Amenify, but the consumer today, yes, is sophisticated and is far more sophisticated than we were in the past, but they're also, a lot more fascinating and dynamic.
Well, maybe it was 2 years ago, Reed, that we read Seven Powers by Hamilton Himmler.
Yeah, I was going to go hooked with them, but
okay,
you can jump into Seven Powers.
Well, I was just saying, Hamilton says that one of the 7 powers of a great business can be brand loyalty. So I understand where you're saying there's a conversation out there that there's maybe saying dead is a nice clickbaity way to put it, but I'd say maybe there's less appetite to put up with annoyances of brand now, but you still have people that are super, a Mercedes or an Apple or a Tiffany's. But in multifamily, I don't know that I ever experienced or I've not witnessed, it seems like, real brand loyalty. I know there's a lot of multifamily property managers that are having that conversation to say like, okay, I was trying to think of an example, but wasn't it like Avenue, whatever.
Avenue 5?
Thank you. Yeah, like they had talked about like, okay, should we go with a strategy where we go to market that way? And then, so I'm wondering how you think about that first on like the property management side. Have you witnessed great brand loyalty in a demonstrable sense, I guess, where it's real worth it? And I guess then we can take it from there. And if you want to mention anything about Hooked, you can.
Oh, go ahead. You can respond to that first.
Well, I guess, so it's a great question. And I think it's hard to say, I think it's hard to sit here and say definitively whether, I've witnessed or I haven't witnessed actual anecdotal instances of brand loyalty. I think, the consumer today has certain characteristics about them that are clear. They're more sophisticated, but they're clear characteristics about them. And I think the question is the multifamily industry thinking about those characteristics and thinking about delivering against those characteristics, given the unique advantages or access that they have to that resident, given that they live in their properties, right? Residents are they're multi-device, multi-channel, right? So in multifamily, as an operator, are you thinking about, hey, am I hitting them through all the various channels that I have access to them on? And am I sending them the right message at the right time, right? They care about personalization in that sense. So are you hitting them multi-channel? Are you creating a lifestyle? Are you creating relevance and personalization? Those are kind of their characteristics that I think, and we can dive into those a little bit more. But when I was at Amenify, that was some of the things that we were thinking about with regard to that second point around creating a lifestyle, right? The consumer or the resident thinks about those things, and I think it depends on the class of the asset, but the resident thinks about those things like, what does this brand stand for, right? And does that line up with my values on a personal level? And if they care about community and they care about engaging with the residents around them, right? What are the services? What's the programming that community is offering? And so just if we think about that sort of looking through that lens, that was where Amenify had the ability to kind of fit in to that part of the equation. Is like, hey, are you offering a lifestyle to these residents? Are you offering, ways for them to engage with other residents, but also providing them with services that puts time back in their day so they can go, to that happy hour, hang out with their neighbors and whatnot, take their dog on a walk because, their place is being cleaned for them. Not to necessarily put it just back on you, but I'm curious as you guys work with a lot of multifamily operators and a lot of what you guys help them with is messaging and delivery of that messaging. How does that vary, operator by operator in terms of how they position their brand?
Well, there are certainly some folks that have talked to me personally, and I'll be curious to get your take, Reed, but about like, how do they develop their brand, and should they really be developing a corporate brand, or should they be developing just a brand on the property, like on that individual asset? I think one of the challenges I've seen in this industry is that we deal with a lot of third-party managers. It used to be like 80% of our business, but now it's probably 50%. But if you think about a third-party manager, they don't really care as much about the guy's asset across the street that you manage. They care about their asset. And then there's some ego, it seems, tied up into it with the owner of the asset, where they're like, well, I care about my brand and what I'm doing for this thing, and I want to build it up and then probably flip it, for a profit. So I actually think the industry has some fundamental things with the way it approaches things from a third-party management standpoint, where it's hard to reinforce brand loyalty, because you can't take any of the NMHC top 50 or takes most of them and just say, great, we're going to go to market with that brand. Because one, it's hard to get great consumer awareness at a mass level if you don't have enough properties. And the only one with with enough properties might be Greystar, because it's everywhere, versus these regional brands. But even Greystar, most of those are then third-party managed, and it's just not the incentive of that. So unless you start doing with like what Hilton does or something, where it's like you are leasing the Hilton brand even though you're third-party managed, then maybe, or any of those, right, hospitality, then maybe. But that would be such a change for the industry that I think it's hard. So then you're basically stuck at the individual asset level. In addition, I don't know that you could go to a full let's promote a Greystar, a Lincoln, a Bozzuto, and make it this consumer brand like the Apple or the Tiffany, because this industry right now, because of the supply situation, and where people want to set rents and then keep raising them if they can by double digits a year, you're in a way, I think, destroying loyalty. If I move into your place, I may have had this great perception, but imagine if I go to buy a car and I I buy this car, and then all of a sudden my oil change this year was $100, and next year it's $200, and then it's $300. I'm going to get really pissed off at that manufacturer, and I'm not going to use that car anymore, right? That's what I think a lot of consumers experience at the property. It's like, my rent was $2,000, and now you're asking me for $2,250, and then you're asking me for $2,500, and you don't care if I move out. And yet I see on your website you're offering 2 months free for someone new to move in, and so you're going to raise my rent and not offer me free. So I don't know, Reed, if you want to add on yet before he responds to I'll say that fundamental issue we have with brand.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think there's a certain amount of forgiveness if you have true brand loyalty that somebody would allow or I guess exhibit, on that whole pricing thing. I think it's not one or the other as far as corporate, you should focus there, or the property. You mentioned the tangible, intangible. It's a good example of that. So I think you don't want to be in a scenario if you're a property management company and I say Greystar and there's no word association with like consumers where they're like, I don't know what that means. I have nothing to say back to you.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's realistic that you're going to get the kind of active resident, if you will, like really leaning into a brand through your corporate, branding. I think that has to happen, at the property site. And that's where you can actually, whether it's community events or whether it's, through social media, whether it's happening within the community itself among residents where people are talking about maybe, DEI or environmental different issues. And that's where that core value connectivity can happen and you can really touch it and feel it versus what happens at the corporate level. I agree. One of the biggest challenges, coming back to David's point about pricing, that you would face if Greystar were to say, hey, we want to be as well known as McDonald's, like with the day-to-day person out there. But I don't think anyone's really gone that aggressive or been that bold to make that move because it is costly. I mean, it costs a ton of money to do that amount of marketing and advertising, but I think it's there for the taking. I'd be really excited and interested to see, and no knock to Greystar, but I'd be even more intrigued to see somebody that wasn't Greystar go after that and say, hey, this is the essence of like this management company. And we very much are about, these kind of core issues, not core issues, but core values. And whether that had an impact, but somebody would need to have the capital and the courage to do that because there's no guarantees that it would in fact have the outcome that they were looking for. Because we hear that all the time with advertising marketing. I don't know how well it's working. How do I really define that? My last, point on this thread is how we would define, you went through, and I appreciate that, some of the characteristics of brand loyalty. But that's also what makes it so challenging to defend. It's kind of like SEO, organic social. We're always like trying to talk people through the value of that. And it's fractional, so it makes it hard. You can't just say this is the one thing. And it's the same thing with brand loyalty. So if you're trying to defend like a budget or focus on that when it comes to consumers, you could be looking at social media, you could be looking at usage statistics when you mentioned the platform with Amenify, et cetera. I had more examples, but it's fractional to me. And that makes it so much harder to really, get right, pursue, and then know you're getting the ROI behind it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's a good point. I think the definition of brand loyalty within the context of multifamily, I think, is unique in the sense that you can't look at it necessarily as the living experience at a community and compare that with the brand loyalty of a product like an iPhone or a Yeti cooler, right? Just because the life cycle stage of that consumer, the life stage of that consumer just works differently over the course of someone maybe, at a stage where they're moving into a home, they're purchasing a home, or they're moving to a new city, or they're changing careers, or they're having a family, or they're, going through a divorce or a graduation, whatever you want to call it. And so I think brand loyalty needs to have its sort of own unique definition within the context of multifamily. And I totally hear the pricing issue, right? Like consumers are becoming more sophisticated. It takes a couple of clicks for them to figure out what's going on in the background while their rent is getting, significantly increased year over year. But, on the flip side of it, and to your point, Reed, about, I think there's an opportunity out there for the taking that's not being leveraged is I think the relationship dynamic between the resident and the property, given the tools that are out there and given what's being utilized, is just sort of nowhere near where it needs to be, right? When you talk about the sophisticated brands out there that are able to leverage a captive environment and how they use that captive environment to really create like a holistic relationship with their consumer, I feel like our industry is still, is not at that point, and they're not close, right? Where the number of touch points through a consumer's, sort of day to day and life that our industry could play in and doesn't, and just charges rent and offers four walls and a roof. I think there's a massive gap there. And the tools are out there to be able to close that gap. And I don't know whether that's owner operator, whether it's a, better vendor ecosystem, whether it's, figuring out ways to inject technology and those solutions into the industry faster. But I think that's a huge opportunity that's not yet being utilized.
Well, to Reed's point, I think the mass market McDonald's isn't going to make sense. It's not a leap I would make if I was one of those large operators, but the regional, because you need a certain amount of density, right? Like you can't, I remember when I lived in New York, I had a friend, I drove 300 miles to go to a CiCi's Pizza, because all growing up, they'd heard CiCi's Pizza on the TV, but it's 300 miles away. It's like, so this doesn't make sense. If there's not enough density, why is CiCi's buying the tri-state metro, right? So regionally, if you can get, I don't know what that density is, but if you have enough density, then I think you could. So like Blanton Turner would be my example up in Seattle, or maybe Prometheus down in the Bay Area, where you could do that. But then you make a really good point, Phil, with the life stages. If so many properties we talk to are targeting young professionals, right? And young professionals, what do they do? Like their career changes. They're going to go through like 3 or 4 life stages in 10 years. So it's going to be really hard to get like a decade out of them at your management company, or frankly in an apartment, right? So I think unless you are going super niche. So if it wasn't regional, then maybe it would be niche on like those concepts that have popped up where people, it's almost like a subscription apartment or something, where it's like, all right, I'm a God, this is my first podcast back from paternity leave.
I love it. I'm actually keeping count. I shouldn't have told you, but that's the second. I'm
Major one.
I'm making it simple and calling them blackouts. But, for those that don't know, and I think most of our listeners would, David and his wife had a baby 8 weeks. 8 weeks. 8 weeks ago. And I joked with him about when he came back, I was like, now you're going to know what it's like to be me. Of course, my kids are much older than his, but having those sleep deprived blackouts where he loses his train of thought. Because I'm notorious for them on this podcast. And now David would like count the number of seconds before I could recapture my thinking. I so far am pitching a no-hitter, no blackouts, but you already have 2. So the tide is,
Avenue 5.
Exactly. The tide is turning quickly.
I actually saw Avenue 5 in my head, and I was like, shoot, was that a property or a management company? But this one I do to get digital nomad. So if you have the digital nomads and you just focused on those and you hit the major cities, like you mentioned, Amenify was 25 cities or something, right? So if you had like New York, Boston, Austin, Denver, Bay Area, then maybe you could build a brand where you're like, hey, if you're a digital nomad, this is the one that you go with. And maybe you could get some brand loyalty there. But again, until their life stage changes, they're no longer a digital nomad, they have a family or whatever. So anyways, go for it.
And there are definitely those flexible living sort of platforms that are out there and trying to sort of carve out a market and figure out how to fit into the inventory ecosystem and whatnot. Landing is one of them, right?
Yeah,
there are others, right? And those are really interesting, but just like fitting just the short-term rental industry into multifamily, with, a pandemic in between, there are multiple cycles of these business models and companies that are going to run through, try to figure out how to make it work inside a multifamily. Some blood's going to get spilled, right? It's not easy. And in fairness to your point earlier, at Amenify, we did have the ability to, when a resident reached out and said, hey, great news. I used to live at this Amenify property and now I live at this. Can you transfer my account? We had the ability to do that. And it was infrequent. Mm-hmm. Did not happen very often. Mm-hmm. Right. And so if you're building a portfolio and an offering that serves a specific life stage of a consumer, you have to ask the question, hey, maybe it's unrealistic to say, oh, we expect that someone's going to move from this apartment to another apartment, under our umbrella, and maybe think more about, while they're living at the, these are consumers that think of themselves as brands, think of themselves as the ability to influence. And when they like a brand, and when a brand resonates to them, when a service offering resonates to them, they want to tell their peers about it. Do you think about brand loyalty differently given that life cycle or life stage challenge of the consumer? And maybe it's more through the lens of, okay, well, how and in what way does that resident engage with the property and engage with the community while they're living there, right? And what's the usage rate of these amenities that we offer, these services we offer? Like, how often are they coming to our events, things like that? How well can we sort of foster that sense of community while they're living at the community to sort of make them an advocate moving forward. Because at some point in the next couple of years, we're marketing to one type of life stage, and they're going to move on. They're going to move to another city. They're going to get married. They're going to buy a home, and they're just not going to be in market for our product anymore. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
I forgot. I don't think we asked Everett this. I definitely hit him a few times on, KPIs, how they were going about the business development, and then just the general business model. But do the properties get a cut, like with these vendors?
As of right now, to kind of peel back a curtain right now, as of right now,
putting you on the spot.
Yeah, as of right now, the properties don't get a cut. However, we anticipate that that's going to need to be part of Amenify's business at some point, in the sense that, like, maybe we need more competition, more folks that are sort of pushing us in that direction. But, Amenify is a revenue center, right? We leverage the resident wallet as opposed to the property wallet in terms of how we monetize, right? So, that is we believe, or, when I was last there, Amenify believed that is inevitable. But I look at that as a big opportunity for the industry, right? Like one of the things I get super excited about is when I see that, like, operators have really well developed ancillary teams where they're doing managed Wi-Fi, and they've converted a couple of floors to STR, and they've got like some kind of a retail component, whether it's a coffee shop or something, and they're growing NOI through these sort of ancillary channels, parking, whatever, you name it, right? There is so many I think there are so many opportunities, Amenify included, right, for you to expand the dynamic of the relationship with the resident beyond just rent, to be able to offer these services, given that they live right there in your building. And so I think that's more of an opportunity than sort of a crossroads, if you will.
Yeah, it makes sense to me, because if you don't start offering that, then, what's to stop eventually, some of these property management companies that have higher densities start developing this themselves and going direct versus, I don't see that happening for a lot of reasons, but theoretically that could happen if you got too complacent and didn't start looping them in on those. But coming back to those proof points, and this is still somewhat connected to the brand loyalty, but, and I'm honing in on Amenify, but this is for a lot of prop tech. Is it the usage, where it's like, that's how we are demonstrating. So you see just through usage statistics that they are very active, or is it through like NPS? It's like, and that's when we say NPS, it's not just the experience of the property, but specifically amenities, and that's how we're going to demonstrate this. Or is it like you can see through social media, when you mentioned like referring out and saying this is something we want to see more and more, is that what you point to? Is it the NOI? It's fractional. That's my word of the podcast, but you have all these avenues, to your point, which is great, because it's like we have a lot of different things that we can point to and ultimately build off and evolve the business model, which gives us the longevity that obviously at least investors would be excited to see. So it's interesting. Yeah,
it's topical given the brand loyalty conversation. There are ways that at Amenify, when I was there, we thought about, hey, how are we doing a good job, right? And there's metrics that I can talk about. And then there's externally, how does the customer, not the resident customer, but the property customer think about us? And we thought about, the property as being the number one customer, the resident as a very close second, and the service provider as a third. And so how does the property think about us as as that customer, and how does the service provider think about us? And the dynamic was night and day different, right? With regard to the residents, all the things you'd assume, right? Every time they have a service, they rate it out of 5. What's our rating? What's their purchase rate? What's their repurchase rate? How do we keep residents from going dormant? In terms of number of days between buying a service, every service has a different dormant time frame, right? As I'm sure you can imagine, meal delivery is much shorter, tighter time frame going dormant than housekeeping. But the B2B client, the property management company or the real estate managers was the most interesting in terms of them evaluating us as a customer, and it depended on who they were, right? And a lot of times for the higher end vertically integrated brands that or REITs that just controlled the entire experience, they were evaluating us in the same way that we were internally and saying, I want to see reports of the ratings every month. I want to see what like the confirmation rates are on the services and whatnot. And this is sort of more a statement of the industry, but when it came to the third party managers, they're, as we know, property management is a hard business, right? And so they're running around either trying to win new business or trying to keep the business that they have. And oftentimes, in fact, more often not, their main concern was, I just don't want to hear about Amenify. And if I don't hear from you, that means everything's fine and we're good and you could stay at the property. And then, of course, they wanted to drop, Amenify's 3 or 4 slides into their client pitches to be able to say, hey, look at this cool technology, tech-enabled service platform that we use. Here's why you should hire us to manage your property for you. And so it was very different. The dynamic of like those multifamily customers and what they actually cared about was very different across the different sort of customer types.
So where do you think this needs to go when it comes to brand or how should multifamily be thinking about brand with their consumer? I think you started to sort of talk about customer experience, which I totally agree with you. To me, that seems like when you mentioned wanting to stay in prop tech, I mean, that'd be interesting if that was the angle you thought you should go, because you have the big PMS systems or whatever that should be the customer experience system, but that I don't think they think of the consumer as their customer at all, like a distant customer, right? So would you be saying that customer experience is where multifamily should focus for brand or something else? So
one thing I'm not an expert in is the sort of endemic sort of touch points throughout the resident life cycle that these major PMS systems are supposed to be responsible for, right? Like what's the SLA on like when a management ticket gets submitted, how does that team respond and engage with that resident and solve that issue? Like I'm not an expert there. And so I don't want to just, sort of make comments on that. But when I think about more broadly, the power of, and when I say the power, like the value on those credit cards that all those residents are holding in their back pockets, when I think about all of the different services and products and brands that consumers interact with on a daily, monthly, quarterly, annual basis, and the captive nature of the relationship between, or the opportunity of the captive nature of the relationship between the property and the resident. I think when you think about all those touch points should be mapped. And there should be a list of all those touch points. So like, what does the resident do? Just simple example. The resident hires or pays for subscribes to an internet service, right? Just as one example, right? That's one touch point, right? Those touch points should be mapped. And this is a very pie in the sky. I'm not saying we're close to this. I'm saying this is how I feel the relationship dynamic should be between the property and the resident, is with those mapped touch points between, consumers and services. We should look at that list. The industry should look at that list and then ask the question, why are we not offering this service, right? If there's a reasonable, pragmatic reason why it just doesn't make sense to offer that service, powered by a third party through the property, where the property is the touch point, but it's powered elsewhere to sort of operationally make it realistic. That's the way I think about brand loyalty, in the sense that, it's a bad word when I actually say it, but the real estate should own, in every sense of the word, the life cycle of that resident, and think of them almost more as consumers, not just, hey, our responsibility is make sure your fridge works, your pipes don't leak.
Yeah.
Right. So I may be getting too pie in the sky and speaking too broadly, but I think that's the opportunity, and I don't think we're close to it, but That's sort of how I think about the mission.
But why not? It's kind of like if you were a mall operator, your idea is like, okay, how could I get more of these consumers to not just go into the flagship Macy's or something and go to the food court and do these other things? So it makes sense. I was going to actually use the word opportunity if you hadn't gone there, because what you're saying is that Reed always internally talks about share of wallet, and the property. I mean, your rent is a big part of your expense. I don't know, on average, like 20% for some people, but that's only 20%. So you're leaving 80% on the table, right? And you have a captive audience if they're there. So you're more of saying the opportunity is how do you monetize or, whatever. And it doesn't all have to be in this like Scrooge McDuck way, like how I take those.
Totally. And I'll give you an example that we thought about and piloted a little bit at Amenify. But, when you talk about, we've been saying, fractional has been your word of the podcast, mine's life cycle stage, right? But a life cycle stage is super valuable to brands. Brands want to know when a birth, a death, a graduation, a marriage, a divorce is happening, right? Because that is where it's a fork in the road for consumers, where they think about things differently, they form new relationships, right? And the holy grail of life cycle stages is a new mover. Right, a new mover spends $9,000 and interacts with like 75 new brands in the first 3 months of a move, right? And brands climb over themselves, over each other to try to get access to a new mover. To, you walk into these apartment buildings, you see those envelopes of coupons. It's just a pile of them because brands are just trying to find who that new mover is. There's those stories of, the dad that gets upset at Target because, they were sending pregnancy ads, or they were sending diaper ads to his daughter. And it turns out his daughter was pregnant and the internet knew it before he did. So it's like the life cycle stage value is so high. And we know more than anyone who a new mover is, right? And so why, as a very simple example, why couldn't you move into a new unit, right? And in the fridge is Blue Apron, and in the pantry is all of these sort of Tide-powered CPG products, and in the bathroom is, Harry's and, or Dollar Shave Club, and all of these like high value placements at a very high value life cycle stage. And you're now exponentially enhancing the move-in process, because people have 30 boxes in their living room and they don't know which box has the thing that they need, but now you're solving it because there's paper towels in the kitchen already. And there's, there are, samples of the products that they need curated throughout the unit to just make their move-in experience, more pleasant. And does that mean they're going to rent again? Who knows, right? Who knows whether they got to move cities or buy a home or whatnot, but there are so many opportunities in TouchMan. That's a huge ancillary opportunity right there to enhance the living experience of the resident and expand the dynamic of that relationship.
Well, Reed, we're close on time, so why don't you try to land this plane?
Well, I don't know if this would help land the plane, but it's just something that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on, and partly for Amenify, but in general. The book Hooked, it's about product and how you build great products. And it simplifies things, products into vitamins or painkillers. And meaning you have to be one or the other, and the dream is to be both. But if you're going to build a lasting product, you have to be solving a big problem, which is the painkiller, or you have to just be the daily vitamin, where it's like they have to have it every day. And I think that's what would be tough, or I imagine was with Amenify, still is that you're not necessarily one or the other, but you have the potential maybe to be both, which is to get that kind of daily active usage. And that's where maybe more like kind of the intercommunity or resident like play is critical, versus just counting on them, as you mentioned, whether it's the housekeeping, dog walking, or whether it's food. How do you get them regularly into the platform? And how does brand loyalty fit inside of that? And it seems like brand loyalty would skew more towards the vitamin, but the book doesn't actually, validate that. It says you'd be surprised that you can create as much brand loyalty through a painkiller as you can through a daily vitamin. And the example, there's several that the book cites as far as, the multiplier of getting to both is Facebook. It started with more of the daily vitamin, where it's like, just thought it was so cool to be able to see what other people were doing. And, I'll go as far as using the V word, but, almost the voyeur, tapping into that, where it's like, what's happening with my friends, with my family. but then they were able to get to a painkiller because it was the connectivity, which obviously is kind of the mantra or slogan there about connecting the world, but where now I use it as a tool that I didn't have before to stay connected, with family members. So I think it's fascinating when we talk about brand loyalty with the consumer, which side of that spectrum you're really on. And then is there a path to get to both? And I feel like with where Amenify's at and some of the things, opportunities you described, the opportunity to deliver on both of those is there. It's not achieved yet, but as you talk about all these different touch points and life cycle, I think it's exciting to think that if you guys get it right, that you may end up both a painkiller and a daily vitamin.
Yeah, I think so. It's really. I wrote that down, so I'm going to read that. So it sounds interesting, but I think whether you're in the vitamin painkiller category, you cross over, you're in both. I think what I experienced sort of as we sort of had to become direct consumer marketers at Amenify was it came down to personalization and relevance, right? You've got attributes about the resident, you've got data about the resident, and you've got behavioral data on how they've interacted with your product or how they've interacted with your messaging. And in there is a formula of the lowest hanging fruit of the folks that, have said they're moving out and need a move out clean, or, just had a Thanksgiving dinner and need a housekeeper to come over, or, you're offering a service that, like a take and bake meal delivery offering, and it's about to be a 3-day weekend and the stores are going to be closed, and you're messaging them, hey, is your fridge stocked for the weekend, right? And tie that into all the different layers of data that you have access to be able to deliver that really relevant message. One, because it's going to drive whether it's a painkiller or a vitamin, but also that's at this point, like that's what consumers expect. And it sounds crazy to say, but it's almost to use your analogy, it's almost a poison pill for a company if they deliver a message at the wrong time to a consumer. They're almost that sophisticated to say, like, whoa, like that's not relevant to me. Like I didn't try that product, or I didn't leave my cart empty. Like I didn't leave my cart without checking out. Like I'm unsubscribing. Like, and so that's what I found. There's so much more, right, dynamism to the entire equation, but that was just, regardless of what you fell into, that, I found that data and personalization and relevance was super important to being able to cut through the noise of the 100 emails people receive from marketers.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating time. David knows I can go off the deep end when we talk personalization, but just, we're at an era also where we talk about more sophistication and awareness of the consumer. And a lot of that is around data and data privacy. And so the expectation for personalization is at its highest. It's at a peak where it's like, how dare you send me that ad, on this day? It's like, you got it wrong. Versus, the backlash right now about data and what people know, what brands know, because it's like, you should not know that about me.
Yeah.
So it puts brands and especially in the consumer side in a really tough spot on where they're going to fall within that spectrum of like, we're going to give you the most personalized experience in the world, but not creep you out at the same time. So yeah, fascinating kind of intersection we're at right now with all that.
Yeah, that's probably a topic for a dedicated podcast on its own.
Yeah. If you scour through a few more of our episodes, you'll hear that. You'll notice that's a theme.
Well, Phil, is there anything else you want to say before we get out of here?
No, I mean, this was super fun, and enjoyed chatting with you guys. And can't see it from here, but great office. And hopefully, you'll offer me a tour after we get done.
Yeah, I'll give you a tour. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, so I've got at the moment, I'm Phil Matsuhashi on LinkedIn.
Everybody knows how to spell that, right?
Yeah, Matsuhashi. SHI. And, sure, email as well. I'm doing some consulting engagements right now. And so that is Phil at Colfax Ventures, Colfax like the street, ventures.com. And that's how you get in touch with me.
Cool. We'll put that in the show notes. So if people need to get in touch, they don't have to try to slow it down and type it out for you. Well, Phil, thank you. Appreciate the time.
Great chatting with you guys.
Yeah, it was awesome.